Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to present, Raquel and myself, culturally responsive teaching and learning in the classroom. We'll provide an overview of equity mindedness and what it means within the context of this community, as well as talk about some of the techniques we integrate in each of our classrooms.
All right, so I'll start first with a general overview of what is equity. And I think one of the helpful things to know about what equity is a little bit of the history of it and why we have this equity model, where it came from, and then also it helps us better understand what exactly it is. So equity itself, this idea of equity, is really rooted in an ideal, or like this American ideal of like equal educational opportunity, right? But what equal educational opportunity means has really changed over the course of history. And one of the major moments of this change was with the Brown versus Board of Education decision way back in 1954. And before this decision, before the Brown versus Board of Education decision, equality of educational opportunity was really understood as what we could say equal inputs. Or in other words, the idea was if you provide equal access to curriculum or public schooling or whatever, then we have achieved equality. And so that's like an old version of equality, this idea that you just need to give all students the same curriculum or the same pedagogy and there's equality. But with this Brown versus Board decision and the case, it really shifted the focus of what equality or equality of educational opportunity is. And it shifted it to focus on outputs. The idea being you will have equality of educational opportunity when we see equal outputs or outcomes amongst all categories of students. And if you don't have equal outcomes amongst all categories of students, then that's indicative of some form of systemic bias. And the idea is that you could be equally exposing all students to the same curriculum or the same pedagogy, but that curriculum could itself be biased, right? And so that would produce unequal outcomes. And that's indicative of this systemic bias that needs to be overcome. So over the decades after 1954, there became like a growing consensus amongst researchers and educators that equality of educational opportunity really exists when you have what we call equity. And that's when you have equal outcomes or parity of results amongst all categories of students. And again, if you don't, then that's indicative of some kind of systemic bias. And I just want to point out that, there's a lot of discussion about equity and racial equity and why are we focusing on race? And I think this brief history, right, really shows us not only what equity is, but that really it began with a focus on the effect of systemic racism. And really the beginning of equity was about race. And, later over the years, researchers of other categories of students or concerns like women, students of different ability status, of course, they also adopted the equity model, but it really began about race. So the tenets of the equity model are, as I have up there first, equal outcomes, right? So you have achieved equality of educational opportunity when you have equal outcomes amongst various categories of students. And if you don't have that, then there's a problem, a systemic problem. We call those equity gaps as indicative of a systemic problem. And secondly, that schools are responsible for eliminating equity gaps. So again, referencing the Brown versus Board of Education, before then, the idea was students are responsible for their own performance, right? So equality exists when you expose all students to public education, and then it's up to the student to perform. And if they don't perform well, that's the student's fault, right? But then when we shift the focus to systemic issues and unequal outcomes, then the recognition was, well, there's a school or a systemic problem for unequal outcomes, and therefore schools are responsible, for remedying or redressing any historical legacies or contemporary forms of marginalization and oppression of students. And so schools, therefore, must take some, affirmative steps in order to achieve equal outcomes. And so that's what we are focusing on today. What can we do in order to eliminate the systemic biases that exist in schools and beyond? So I hope that kind of answers that. And so now I'll pass it on to Marissa.
Thank you. So thinking about equity and how equity is defined and this kind of historic decision, we know that there are still clear equity gaps today, right? And there's still a lot of work to do. And so EMTLI defines equity-minded teaching, synthesizing 4 kind of key approaches. So the first one is culturally responsive teaching, which really shifts the thought process from a deficit-minded model to more of an asset perspective. Then we have culturally relevant pedagogy, the community cultural wealth model, and educational equity. And when we think about all of these approaches, there's similarities and differences. If you read all of the papers about them, there's a lot of similarities between each of these approaches. But one of the main things that stands out is it's an asset-based model, right? And it kind of values students' lived experiences and acknowledges that students come to us with a wealth of knowledge and experiences. And we need to recognize that in the classroom and create curriculum and employ teaching strategies that foster those types of experiences. And so in terms of EMTLI's definition, there's 4 key tenets. The first one is connect students to knowledge and cultural knowledge. Connect students, I want to say students is knowledge and cultural wealth to academic skills and concepts. Critical reflections about society and lives. Cultural competence, which is valuing cultures of students and historically racially marginalized groups. And finally, the last tenet is the explicit critique of power structures and active pursuit of social justice and having these conversations in the classroom. So with that, is it Raquel? Are you? Yes, next.
So the way that we'll present this is we're going to kind of go through each one of those 4 pieces that Marissa just went over, and we'll each give an example and connect it to one of those 4. And then we'll also talk about ways that you can use our ideas in other disciplines, because we recognize some of these, you know, of course, work in our discipline, but we also thought about how could we communicate how to use these same ideas perhaps in other disciplines. So could you put click, Marissa? So the first one I'll go, I'm going to talk about the first point, which is academic skills and concepts and connecting to students' cultural reference and knowledge. And so one thing that I've started to do is, allow students to make their own decisions as to what exactly they want to do, and I'll explain more in a second. And also I found it really exciting to increasingly value social media posts and memes. And so let me talk about how I do that specifically. So could you push click? All right, so in my social problems class, this is from my social problems class, I have them do a project and they pick a social problem they want to do their course project on. So that's, their decisions. And then each assignment builds up for this course project. And then they kind of, have to look for the stuff to, they have to look for things to do the assignment. So one of the parts of this project is understanding what a claim is, a claim about a social problem. I go over what a claim is, and then they have to, on the first assignment, find an example of a claim about their social problem. And in the past, I used to ask students to find like a news article or an opinion article that was a claim, right, in the newspaper, online, or whatever. But then, because I was trying to be all academic and stuff. And then I was like realizing that I'm always on social media. I learn about social problems a lot on social media. Social media is where we get so much of our knowledge from, whatever we're engaging with on social media. And memes, I have this huge fascination with memes. So I'm going to start, encouraging my students to really pay attention to how our ideas shaped by whatever's happening in the social media. So I love memes. So I brought up this, I bring up an example to talk about how a meme or a social media post could qualify as what we're calling claims. So this is an example, it's a little old, I have to find a more recent one. But this is one that I bring in first to demonstrate that, something you see on social media can qualify as a claim in the sense that it's describing a problem, it's telling us why we should care, and it's telling us the solution, right? The comparison between Cardi B and Bill Cosby is ignorance. Y'all need to cut it out. That was posted by a friend, and it's very simple, but I say, look, this qualifies as a claim. It operates in a particular way. And so we go over it a little bit, and then they go do their assignment. So here's some examples of ones that students have submitted. And could you push click a couple more times? I think I put 3. Yeah, thank you. So these are from this year. I have one student who's focusing on anti-Asian sentiment and violence, another student who's focusing on mass incarceration as informed by the war on drugs or marijuana more specifically, and then another student who's doing street harassment. And they all submitted memes either from like Facebook or something, or 2 of these are from Instagram. And they were all great, and I loved it. And when I grade their assignment, kind of to check that it does qualify as a claim, I give them feedback like, I'm so excited you brought in social media, because again, why I already described before. So this is an example again from my own class, but now we can talk a little bit about how maybe if you don't already, and maybe a lot of you already do this, but how can you use or incorporate students' own use of social media to connect with your own discipline. And these are just ideas I came up with, but maybe you come up with others. But the first bullet point there is there a way that students maybe can find their own examples of concepts that you're discussing in class? I've done that in my 120 class, and students find amazing things. So maybe you could do that as an assignment. But sometimes it's also fun to maybe have your students find social media examples of concepts used incorrectly. And that's really something I've personally seen a lot with regards to like COVID-19. So Marissa, can you click one more time? I bring up this example, and I kind of joke that because y'all know how being on social media can cause a lot of anxiety, at least for me. Like I'll be on there focused on some issue, and it's just making me like more and more either anxious, and my partner's like, get off of social media, right? And I'm like, no. So my excuse is like, I'm looking for material for my class. So I came up, so this is an example of someone that, to be honest, I just continue to follow this person because they give me good, they give me good material. So this is an example of, how math or statistics is used incorrectly on Fox News and social media. I had this social media friend post this, and I was like, this is so bad. So I bring this up, and because in my class, we talk about how statistics are used to communicate the scope of a social problem, right? And so you have to be able to at least understand the basics of, statistics. What are they actually saying? Is it being presented in a way that is accurate, et cetera? And so we analyze this. And so we say, what's going on here? It seems really true, and it seems really baffling. And as my Instagram friend, quote unquote, put, what WTF? But then as we analyze it, we realize that this is an image of Fox News, who's supposedly presenting the ratio, the infection fatality ratio, but then putting the percentage on the numbers. And so it's actually making it seem like the infection fatality rate is smaller than it actually is. And so, that's just an example of how perhaps an assignment could be, find a social media post or something that is using a concept incorrectly. And I think that can be done in a wide array of disciplines. So that's that.
Now, so for my piece about academic skills and concepts, I just wanted to also say that when Raquel and we're putting this presentation together, there's a lot of overlap between these 4 key tenets, right? So they all fit in like a little box. And so as you're thinking about employing equity-minded strategies in your classroom, there's probably going to be overlap in these things. So for my academic skills and concepts, I am focusing specifically on valuing culture in the classroom. And one of the ways that I've found is effective is setting the tone of the course even before the first day of class. So I have tried to establish norms in class of equity from day one, especially because of some of the things that I teach when we're talking about social psychology, prejudice, discrimination. If that tone isn't set from day one, it's really hard to have open and honest conversations about these things when we're further on in the class. So what I do is, in order to create an inclusive environment in a virtual space, as I survey students before the class starts. So what this means is, if my class starts on a Monday, I will publish the class the Monday before class starts. And I have my welcome letter, I have my welcome video, I have an orientation module. And in this orientation module, they learn a little bit about the class, I learn a little bit about them. in two forms, a survey, which just goes directly to me, and then a who am I discussion. Now, the due dates for these are not due until class actually starts, but students are more than welcome and encouraged to complete it before we meet via Zoom or online. So some of the questions that I've added on the survey are their pronouns. So I ask them, what are their pronouns? I don't say, what are your preferred pronouns? Just what are your pronouns? And for every single question, there's a space that they can select that's prefer not to say or don't want to answer. Their name preference. So we know in Canvas, for example, a student might have a name, but they go by a nickname or they go by a preferred name. And so I also ask that so that way when I'm grading, I can use their preferred name as early as possible as opposed to later on in the class. Questions on race and ethnicity. Again, this is something that they can prefer to skip. I ask them to tell me just an open-ended experience in an online classroom. So do they like online classes? What do they like? What do they dislike? And I say that you can share little information with me as possible or as much information as you want. Their learning style. So how do they prefer to learn? And I tell them I'm asking about this because I tailor all of my classes. So what I do in one section of Psych 120, for example, doesn't necessarily mirror another section of Psych 120 because I have different students and different types of learning styles in each class. It's a little bit more work because I can't just, import a class from Canvas and then go about my day, but I feel students really appreciate it, and I find that my rates of retention and success are more successful in that way. And then finally, I ask them about some challenges that they may be experiencing, challenges related to learning, challenges, anything they feel like they might be experiencing that could contribute to not being able to complete assignments, for example, not making it to class. And I say, I understand, we all have a lot going on. I just would like to be aware of this so that way I'm not sending you multiple emails checking in all the time. Hey, how are you? I haven't seen you in class. That way, if I know, then I'm not going to email them every single week. And I've gotten really positive feedback, especially with the pronouns and the name preference piece from my students. And then the other thing I do is a who am I discussion, which I tailor based on the specific class that I'm teaching. So I ask them to provide a summary of who they are, reasons that they might be taking the course, perceptions of social psychology, cognitive psychology, public health, whatever that course might be. Specific questions related to current events. So I've asked before, like how you're handling the pandemic. I'm teaching a summer school class on Monday. I'm asking them about how has the transition gone from kind of being in quarantine to reacclimating to this new way of life. And then any images that are relevant to the class. So in my cross-cultural class, I ask them to insert an image that they connect with from their culture. In my public health class, I ask them what public health means to them in the form of an image. And so these discussions can be adapted based on the classes you teach. It's not kind of this only works in the context of psychology. You can really adapt it to your discipline. And then I really like this one. Students really like the images. Some of them post videos because you can see that they're connecting right away. They'll say, oh, I really like that, or I'm from this culture too. It's really interesting that you chose this image and this is what I think. So from day one, there's already some type of sense of community established and valuing different lived experiences. What is next? Is it still me? Okay, yes, okay. The other activity that I have is exploring cultural context and lived experiences and what I call a what's in my bag activity. So students get to know each other kind of in like an old school like show and tell format that actually adults seem to really like. So what I have them do either in person or online is pick 3 items that help explain who they are. If I'm doing this in an intro to psychology course, I tie it to just self-concept. If I'm doing my cross-cultural psychology course, I tie it to 3 items that explain your culture. And so I asked them to define, what does culture mean to them? Because while we have, the textbook definition, we all define culture differently, and how we view our own culture is really important to recognize. And then I have them connect items to course concepts and the self. And again, this is an activity that can be adapted to multiple courses. So for example, if you're teaching, I don't know, a course in the sciences, right? We can think about different items in our house, different items that we've grown up with that are related to science, and think about something, and maybe it's an item that we use every day, and we haven't even thought about it in that context. And then students can bring in the item and talk about it. When I do it online, I just have students take pictures and then submit. There's like 3 different boxes that they attach these pictures to, and then have a discussion. And for this specific activity, in an online environment, it's a discussion, so students comment on each other's items and things like that. Next.
I love that idea. I might have to steal that one, the what's in my bag. That sounds awesome. So the next is having to do with actually the points numbers 2 and 4 on that initial slide. Engaging students in critical reflection of their lives and of society, and also engaging students in critical reflections or critiques of the structures of power. And so a change I made recently is I incorporated in my Sociology 120, that's the intro to sociology, this book called Reclaiming Our Stories 2. This is the 2nd edition, and actually they're coming out with the 3rd edition. And this is a book of personal narratives that depict the struggles and the traumas, as well as the forms of resistance and achievements of those who grew up in Southeast San Diego. So these are people who grew up here locally, and they're stories of writers who are predominantly Black and brown, poor San Diegans, and they deal with a complex array of issues like race and class, gender, mental and physical health, disability, identity, etc. And so I'm kind of going over the points of why I really like using this book. And this is something new, before last year, or last semester, I think was the first time I did it. Before last semester, I just relied on like a sociology textbook. So I incorporate this one to accompany the sociology textbook. And I can talk a little bit later if you are curious how I got students to get this book, because it does cost money. And I, especially during COVID, was very much cautious of like, how students having to pay. So I can talk about that later. So the second bullet point, reclaiming the narrative, this is a book where it's people talking about their own real lives in their own words. And so I think that really challenges the history of sociology and probably all these other fields where you have the lives and communities of color being described by like white researchers, right? And inaccurately depicting them, or, describing them in dehumanizing or stereotypical ways. So this is really, the people telling their own lives. And you have stories in here from gang members, you have, former and current gang members, people who have been incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, former prostitutes, or I'm sorry, sex workers. See, I'm already making a mistake, sex workers. And it really humanizes the people, and it challenges stereotypes and fears and irrational fears that I think that the public has of various categories of people. So it really humanizes those who have been marginalized, criminalized, dismissed, neglected by society. But it also, what it does, because we talk about systems of oppression in sociology, of course, it illuminates how systems of oppression operate like in real life, how individuals are affected, the challenges they encounter due to these systems of oppression. But also, I think that this book is very empowering because it reflects various aspects of various of our students' lives. I think in a lot of ways, recognize and celebrates the strengths and acts of resistance and subversive acts that students might engage in, you know, the agency, the fact that they have agency, and that agency can play a role in, even in a, you know, quote unquote small way, to challenge the systems of oppression because they see it in these stories. And it also shows us as educators how to support our students, or how to support anyone who might be going through similar circumstances. And I want to emphasize, you know, this isn't a story about like, so it's not a story about negative, right? It's a story also about resistance and fighting back, and things like that. And many of the writers in this book are now at UC Berkeley on full rides to UC Berkeley, full rides to UC Santa Barbara, full rides to UCSD. Some are now in their MA programs. Some are working for local nonprofits doing policy work. So, you know, again, very empowering in that sense as well. And so what I do, and I didn't write it on the PowerPoint, but what I do with this story or with this book is I first just give it to the students and I tell them to read it. I kind of give them like assigned chunks of the book to read over the beginning of the semester, like, you know, by week 3, you want to have read the first 50 pages or whatever. And then at the end, the first assignment is what story or stories most impacted you or resonated with you and why. And the feedback on that was really great. Sorry, my eyeglasses are fogging up. The feedback on that was really great, that a lot of students said, this is the first book in college I've read cover to cover, which I was like, that's really exciting. I love to hear that. And this was, you know, by week 6 or something. They've read, you know, they're really excited. Others have, you know, different reasons that it resonated with them. Similar stories. A common story was one student talking about how she was moving from Tijuana to UCSD, her first day to start as a UCSD student, and her father was profiled at the border, went to secondary inspection, was arrested, and the traumatizing effect of that when she's supposed to be having this wonderful day of her first day in college. And a lot of students spoke on that they have similar experiences in their own family and talk about those experiences specifically. Another one is about a student who is Muslim, and she in high school had a teacher who was very Islamophobic towards her in front of the whole class. And so a lot of students felt that really resonated with them. And they spoke of the racism they experienced in high school and how bad it was, et cetera. So that's the beginning. And then over the course of the semester, for most chapters, I'll have them pick a story and say how it relates to anything in the chapter. And so then that way they're connecting the textbook to the stories. And then can you go to the next slide? And so, you know, with sociology, I realized that it's kind of easy in that way. You know, we're talking exactly about what these points that equity mindedness is, right? In sociology, if you're doing sociology right, because some don't, I have to say, you really are focused on, you know, critiquing systems of oppression and, you know, reflecting on society and how is our life shaped by society and how can our life shape society in return, et cetera, right? So for sociology, it's kind of, I can see how it's kind of easy to be incorporating a book like this. But I do, you know, in thinking about how can this translate into other disciplines, so I wrote up here, you know, think about or try to find books, stories, articles, whatever, poems, you know, related to your discipline that one, recognize and celebrate lives and contributions of racially marginalized populations and our students. But also with the second point, and I want to emphasize this, that emphasize forms of resistance, you know, fighting for justice, fighting for liberation, self-determination. And this, I have like kind of a personal story to emphasize this. I hope it's not too personal, but, you know, my mother-in-law is Black and she's an academic. And when I first started meeting her years ago, you know, I'm telling her I'm a sociology and she's like, sociology. She used to teach English, and she's like, you know, I used to be asked by publishers to read sociology textbooks. And she goes, and I always hated it because it was always Black women are at the bottom, you know, and I have to admit, at first I was like, oh, you know, you know, but then I started to realize like sociology, a lot of the ways that the textbooks are written is very much like this, you know, downer kind of almost, you know, just very negative. Like there's not a lot of emphasis at all on how communities have fought back, how you know, equality and justice and stuff have been because of efforts of resistance. And so I always think of her story, right, when I am trying to improve my class, because she's right. The ways that the especially older textbooks is very down and things like that. So that's why I emphasize, find stories that also emphasize the agency of the community that are being represented, and ideally written by them. So how do you find these? So I think it's, start with a simple Google search, take some time to explore how has racism pervaded your discipline. And as I said, because it has, as we know, I think that all disciplines, the way that they're predominantly structured now is still in a very biased way. So for example, I went to sociology grad school, got my PhD, and we never once in any of my classes were asked to read W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a huge influence on sociology. And not one of my grad classes had that. In undergrad, I majored in psychology, and I had never heard of Frantz Fanon. I didn't even hear about Frantz Fanon until I was in grad school in sociology. And he's a huge, he's a psychiatrist in post-colonial studies, critical theory, talks about Marxism, a Marxist, all of these stuff. And it's like, never heard of him. So my point being that definitely in all of our disciplines, there are people who have contributed who are being overlooked. And then we can do that in terms of like math, biology. And I know a lot of you know about like Henrietta Lack's books. Some other ideas I thought about doing this for biology, statistics, and math. We can talk about the social construction of race and the one drop rule, and how that has shaped how we count our population in the census, right? That has to do with counting, that has to do with statistics, that has to do with, the census, obviously. It has to do with biology, that we know biologically there's no, genetic differences, but yet in the world that biology is understood incorrectly. What does that mean for biology? I don't know. So these are just ideas I've had. And then the second thing here, in terms of taking time to explore, to think about whose identities and experiences are typically validated and whose are dismissed. And so I think maybe all of us perhaps in some way could be guilty of having done this at one time, where we're discussing a concept and discussing it from our point of view, as if it's common sense or everyone does it, but then whose examples are being brought in, basically. And I think a lot of times it's ignoring, experiences of students and people of color. And so this example, this picture here, I found it in an article I read about this game called Mancala. It's an ancient game from Ethiopia, and I have one here at my house, and it's actually a really fun game. And the article was talking about how Mancala, this ancient Ethiopian game, can be used to talk about alternative ways of counting. And I don't really know much about math, but it's kind of this example, though, of bringing in alternative examples to teach things like math. So I'm really talking about math and biology and STEM, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of times people think, oh, well, math and science are just objective and neutral, and how in the world does race play a role? But when we start to really explore these things, we realize, in a couple ways I already talked about, that really the way the discipline has been structured, has been racist. People have been ignored. And two, the examples provided tend to favor white people mostly, right? So just to point out that math and science, that no discipline is neutral. Let's say it that way. No discipline is neutral. No discipline is like objective. And so we really need to take some time to explore how that's happening and then try to change it.
I love the sound of the Mancala beads, when they're dropping in. I was just thinking about as you were talking. Okay, so going off of more about this critical reflection and critiques of power, focusing specifically here on exploration of self as well as other cultures. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things that I do in my class that kind of get at this concept. The first one is specifically acknowledging how our lived experiences shape how we view others and ourselves. So what I have students do, and I've only done this in my cross-cultural psychology class. It was the first time I tried it out this past semester, and it was really successful. But I'll talk a little bit about how it can be used in other classes. So I have them create what it's called a cultural sketch using the addressing framework. And the addressing framework, addressing is an acronym, and I have all of what each letter stands for below, as well as Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. I know many of you have shown that TED Talk in your classes. That really resonates with students. And so I did this in the beginning. I set up an individual reflection assignment because these are some pretty in-depth questions. So the first question, for example, is all about the student's age and generational influence. So I asked them to tell me a little bit about when were they born? What were the social expectations when you were born, right? Because we know that it looks very different if we look at Gen X, millennials, boomers, etc. And then I asked them to think about how these generational influences have maybe shaped your worldviews. I have developmental or other disabilities, so ability status. And I say for every single question, you do not need to answer any of these. And I understand that these are very in-depth questions that a lot of classes probably aren't going to cover, but we want to see where we are in order to be able to understand the world and understand the people that we're interacting with. Religion and spirituality, ethnic and racial identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender. So in all of these questions, students talk a little bit about the expectations with whatever category they might identify with and how that has shaped their worldviews, and if they've ever had any negative or positive interactions that stand out within each of these, within the addressing framework. Then I have them tie it back to The Danger of a Single Story, which is Adichie's TED Talk. And thinking about, okay, now that you've kind of built out your own culture sketch and you've seen how dynamic you are, right? All of the different traits, everything that makes up your self-concept. And we know that there's more, but just covering this addressing framework, how does this influence how you view the world? And why is looking at somebody from this very singular, single story perspective, how is that detrimental? And so doing that really makes students aware of their own biases, as well as a lot of times I've gotten feedback this last time about, I wasn't even aware of how my age might play into how I interact with my fellow students. So I got this specifically from an older student. She defines herself as older, so I think I can use that word. But as well as socioeconomic status. And so this activity, again, it's very in-depth. So that's why those icebreaker kind of beginning of course activities are really key if you're going to do something this, for lack of a better word, invasive, I would say, just because it kind of goes against a lot of the activities that are done in more traditional educational classrooms. But this can be done in other classes. So for example, I'll use math. We'd say that math is universal, right? But we know when we look at the literature that there are clear equity gaps in math, specifically by race, by gender, by socioeconomic status. And so you could tie a lot of these things to how you perceive your own math ability, and then go into, the growth versus fixed mindset, go into what stereotype threat is and how we know that there are no differences in math performance, race, gender, etc., and that it's purely a social construct. But making that salient and kind of setting that tone at the beginning of the class could create a more equitable environment. Some of the other things that I've done is inviting guest speakers who foster meaningful connections with students. So being very intentional of who I ask to speak. And actually, I had a guest speaker that after I invited, I realized that they did not connect to the students. So it was a learning experience for me. And I get really good feedback for certain guest speakers, and I'm more likely to invite them back. And you can kind of pick up on, right, when a guest speaker is connecting to the students and when they're acknowledging and being honest about their own lived experiences, as well as privilege that they may not have had and how that has helped them or helped shape to who they are today. Versus I've had some guest speakers that don't really acknowledge that and then thinking, okay, my students aren't connecting here. Creating a final project that focuses on a social issue. So, sorry. For this one, I let students pick the specific topic. I say, you can create a final project on any issue as long as it's relevant. You can tell me a way that it ties back to the class concepts in this class. I don't care what you do, as long as the concepts are connected. And they really like that because it gives them the choice, right? As opposed to I'm saying, you're gonna write a paper on this topic, and I don't care if you don't like it, that's what I want you to do. I also let them choose how to present it. So the only thing I don't allow in my final projects are papers. So they can present however they want. Oh, papers or points. So I say you can do a podcast, you can do a social media post, you can do a website. You can literally go and like get the science projects that we did when we were in like 6th, 7th grade, go get that and, present it on there. I don't care. However you want to do it. I don't want to read a paper, because if we're focusing on a social issue and you want to raise awareness about a social issue, no one in the general public is going to go pick up a paper and read it. Like, let's just be honest. And so they really like that, and they feel like they're kind of in control of what it is they want to present. The last thing I do is a book club. So I'm doing this in my cross-cultural class right now. And like Raquel, I got really positive feedback too. They said the books that were selected are the only books that they're actually reading right now. I'm like, oh no, don't tell me that. But we can do a book club with selections that highlight oppression, systemic inequality, racism, sexism, and resistance. And again, from my discipline, Raquel's discipline, some of the social and behavioral sciences, it seems easy to tie these things in because we're already teaching these concepts. But there are a lot of different books that can be integrated to multiple types of classes. So I have a couple of book club recommendations here that can be tied into STEM classes, can be tied into business classes, into public health classes, psychology, sociology, English. And I know English is already doing a lot of this and has a really good reading list of these types of books. The ones that we're reading in my cross-cultural class right now are The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down and Crazy Like Us. So students were able to choose from one of the two. And then we talk about, they're assigned small group book clubs and based on the book that they're reading. And then we have a discussion in those small groups. The Idealist, The White Man's Burden, Poor Economics, Dead Aid, all of those. I've read them for public health, but a lot of them are written by economists. So you can use them in business classes. You can use them in political science classes. Lies My Teacher Told Me. Oh gosh, Raquel, I hope that's a good book recommendation. I don't know. I read it in my sociology class.
Yes.
Okay. And then Tales of Two Americas, this just came out this year. It has a lot of great writers and essay style stories, as well as The Sum of Us. And I'm sure there's way more recommendations, but I just wanted to give you some like tangible things to think about. And the last thing is cultural competence and specifically connecting course concepts to the real world. So I have students do an intercultural notebook, and you can title this basically whatever you want. Again, this is my cross-cultural class, but I'm planning on implementing something like this in all of my classes. And what I have students do is I think we do it every 3 weeks. They submit an article, photo, video, social media post, podcast, whatever it is they want related to specific course concepts. So for the very first intercultural notebook entry we did in this cross-cultural class, we were talking about individualism and collectivism. So the theme was, okay, go out and find 2 things that depict individualism and 2 that depict collectivism. And then they had to talk about why they felt that each of these depicted individualism or collectivism, how it relates to what we're talking about. How is the media portraying it? So do you see any bias, for example, in it? And if so, what? And so that was very basic. And I have examples of these. So that way students understand what it should look like. So they're not just like, I don't know what to do. So we start with very basic fundamental concepts and then get more specific. So this last intercultural notebook was all about intersectionality and culture. And so finding things that depict intersectionality and in which lens is being used and how is it discussed within the context of cross-cultural psychology. And this is something that could easily be adapted to basically any course as long as you're focusing on the specific concepts that you're covering in that course. And students like it because they can get on social media, like Raquel says she does sometimes. It's like, it's for work, it's for school.